There we go. So I'll say hello and welcome everyone. Although we've been having a conversation before we got started, it is a beautiful day here in just west of London. I can see Neil's making the most of it. Hopefully France is just as good, Mike. Um, yeah, okay. Let's make a start. Let me go over. Let's go back here and then we'll say there we go. Welcome. Good. Well, we're looking at, we're now into Matthew 12. We're not yet halfway through Matthew's Gospel. Seems to have been doing this for a long time. But there you go. We're up to Matthew 12 now. But we're still in the same flow, and we're going to kind of revisit a couple of the last weeks, because as we're going to see, the passage kind of makes us rethink some of what we've already been thinking about. So I've called this Lord of the Sabbaths, and I put an S on the end of it. I did that last second because just something I spotted yesterday in Matthew, which I hadn't, just as I was pulling together the text to put onto the PowerPoint. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Why does Matthew refer to it as Sabbaths in the plural? So there's a quick thought, something to think about. So it kind of kicks off the passage. And if we remember the last couple of weeks, we've had the disciples of John coming to Jesus, and there's a kind of a query going on in John the Baptist's mind, which he needs reassurance on. And I'm on Thursday nights, I'm doing this little series on John the Baptist, and it's interesting that doing that passage in the context while I was thinking about putting together the material for John the Baptist helped me see some things about John the Baptist, which is interesting, and they now kind of colour what's coming out today. So it wasn't a kind of a well worked out plan. It's just the way the things have flown together, and you think, okay, now I can see some things in both directions perhaps I wouldn't have seen otherwise. So there's that message from John, and it then prompts Jesus to make a statement which is really, don't miss the significance of what's going on. So John, and if you think about that, don't miss the significance when he says, if the miracles that happened here had happened in Tyre and Sidon, and if they'd happened in Sodom and Gomorrah, then things would have been different. So we've had that process where there's a challenge going on to the thinking of John the Baptist, who himself came with a message which was think differently, metanoia, think differently about the kingdom. And if you remember a couple of weeks back ago, we were saying, when John comes, Jesus then makes that statement that since the days of John the Baptist, people have looked at the kingdom and seen it as being a violent kingdom, and that violent people kind of winning it. And that was part of the challenge. John who's come and said, think differently about the kingdom of God because it's nearly here. Don't conceive it the way you've always conceived it. Jesus has come. The way he's doing the kingdom is not the way anybody expected, even John the Baptist. It was like he needed to think about his own message, think differently about it. And so he gets reassured because of certain things he does see. In that context, Jesus said, and there's a big chunk of the people who are receiving and seeing something that should totally shift their mindset as to how they understand the victory of God, his Messiah, all of those sorts of things. And then what we're going to read today kind of is within that sort of a flow. And Matthew wants us to understand, because Matthew's gospel follows a very vague kind of flow of order. He's much more, he's thrown, roughly speaking, he throws events in from the right seasons, the right years, the right phases of Jesus' ministry. If you look at Jesus' ministry, it goes through several phases. There is a phase where he's sort of he's under John the Baptist, and it's John's ministry, and Jesus operates within that. That's a kind of almost a private, but it's not totally private, because in that context he turns water into wine, and that's referred to as the first public miracle. So he's a public rabbi, but he's kind of shielded by the fact so much is going on with John. Then when John gets arrested, Jesus starts to tour with his disciples. And then there's a point where he moves and relocates from Capernaum, where he's been based, and he goes down to the south, and that's a separate kind of phase. You see, so Matthew's gospel chronologically follows the basic phases, but he's much more interested in what Jesus was getting across, and he kind of pulls incidents in to reflect the teaching rather than kind of spelling out the incidents and then weaving the teaching into that. So it's just the style of Matthew's gospel, which is much more focused around the words of Jesus than the incidents of Jesus. So that's probably why Matthew here says at that time Jesus went through the grain fields. So he's tying, this isn't, sometimes when he uses an incident, it was totally irrelevant to the time scales and the flow and the order of stuff. It was kind of illustrating what he's just teaching. Here he's tying them in. So chapter 12, I believe, is tied in with this process of what's been going on, the season of life that Jesus is in, which is the transition, as even John the Baptist is having to see the kingdom differently to even what he imagined. So at that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbaths. And in Matthew's gospel, strangely, it's plural. And it's easy to say, well, Matthew does that. Matthew often pluralizes things. There are 2 blind men, there are 2 demoniacs. Well, that's not exactly the same as a plural, but yeah, there are more sometimes in Matthew's gospel. But equally, the phrase "the kingdom of heavens" is actually in the plural. But the kingdom of heavens in the plural is not complicated to understand, because when you refer to heaven in Hebrew or in Aramaic, you refer to it using a plural word in the same way that we refer to a sheep, singular, but using the word sheep, which is also plural. So heavens is just a plural noun in Hebrew. And we're told that Matthew's gospel was originally it was either taken down or first distributed in Hebrew. So actually that little sign, when the fact that Matthew's gospel in the Greek puts heavens in the plural, is a kind of a sign of the underlying Hebrew source material. But that's not true of the word Sabbaths. And Matthew sometimes just uses Sabbath on its own, but here he uses it in the plural. So that made me stop and think, which I'd never really thought about until the other day when I was putting this together. So at that time, the flow of communication from John, the warning about places that are seeing the most but not getting the shift and paradigm, and that's really at the heart, I think, of what when the gospel was first being presented to people, how it totally turned the equations upside down. And I think this is illustrative of that. So his disciples were hungry and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. And you say to yourself, now Matthew doesn't explicitly say why is it important that he flags at this time. And part of the reason is Matthew's gospel doesn't particularly get detailed enough to a particular season in Jesus' ministry. But actually, this incident is also referred to in Luke's gospel. So I've put Luke's gospel there, and it gives us a chronological clue as well. I say as well because it's not obvious why Matthew's is chronological at this stage, but I'll explain in a minute. So in Luke's gospel, the actual Greek says, now it happened on the first Sabbath. But modern scholarship is disagreed on what is meant by the first Sabbath. So most English translations will just say something like, it happened on a particular Sabbath, or it happened on a certain Sabbath. But the ancient commentators were much more unified in their understanding of it. They understood it. The problem is that the commentators are the only place where we have an actual concrete source for the meaning of this verse. So modern scholarship likes to dismiss them because they think they're biased, they want to prove something, they're just trying to make a point. We don't know this from some other source, and ignore it. But their thinking was that there's after the second day of the hang on, I put there you go. So there's a kind of an interesting thing about the idea of Sabbath. It's got Sabbaths plural in Matthew, and it's got first Sabbath in Luke. And so I started as I've kind of meditated on these things before, but then again now, because I was looking at this yesterday, in trying to integrate the Gospels, if the second Sabbath is what the ancient commentators told us it meant, which is after Passover, on the second day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So Passover is the first day of unleavened bread, and you eat unleavened bread with your Passover meal. The next day in the temple, there's a wave offering. And so the wave offering is you take the first fruits of the harvest. The harvest is now the first things that are harvested, brought to the temple. The priest waves them before the Lord, and then the priest gets to keep those things. You see. And then they, after that incident, the waving of the grain offering, which can't take place itself on a Sabbath, so you have to wait until the first is the. Oh no, maybe it can, but it's always the day after Passover anyway. That's the key thing. After that day, you then start counting Sabbaths that happen after that, and you count 7 of them, and that takes you to Pentecost. 7 sevens are 49. It was after the first day of the wave offering. By now, we've gone through 50 days. So now 50 days, Pentecost, and it's the Feast of Pentecost now. And that makes sense. But if that is the case, this is Passover 31 AD. But Matthew's gospel doesn't particularly, until we get to the final Passover, he doesn't make a big thing of Passover. In fact, none of the synoptic gospels really do. They're focused on Jesus fully owns the meaning of Passover on the last Passover, and so they ignore Passover really in the text. But John's gospel does kind of highlight what Jesus does at the different seasons and different feasts. In 31 AD, Jesus is at the Passover in Jerusalem, so you get a little bit of context. And we'll see why the plural Sabbaths comes out perhaps in a minute, because there's a kind of a run of Sabbaths, or there are 2 Sabbaths, and probably the reason why Matthew hints at it by dropping the word, this is my understanding anyway, you don't have to take my word for it, and you won't find it elsewhere, but this is as I've reflected on these things. I think the thing is, Matthew is writing, it's the kind of thing that someone who's deeply invested in their Hebrewisms, in the Hebrew history and so on, and who was around in the first century or in Jerusalem at the time Matthew is issuing his gospel. Some of those folks would see some things without Matthew having to be too explicit. They would know stuff. But if you're outside of that context, if you don't know the Jewish context, it doesn't really add anything to the story. So I'm going to highlight something which, as I say, in one sense doesn't really add to the basic meaning. But if you are embedded in the context and the history and the traditions, then you see something else going on in it. Because in 31 AD, the week before Passover, in John's Gospel, Jesus causes a storm by healing a man on the Sabbath. And remember, here we're going to have a story about the Sabbath, and Jesus breaking the Sabbath. And as you put the bits together, you find this is a season where Jesus seems to quite explicitly be looking to challenge the idea of the Sabbath. It comes across in John's Gospel, and we're going to see then it's recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So on the 31st, in 31 AD, April the 25th, the evening of April the 25th, sun goes down. It's technically now the next day, according to the temple calendar, because if you've looked at the Passover week, we see that Jesus seems to be using a Galilean calendar, slightly different approach. But according to the temple calendar, it's now Passover, which is itself, so it's mainly Thursday, Wednesday night through Thursday. Passover actually is a Sabbath, so it's the first day of unleavened bread. So it's a Sabbath, and it's a few days after a Saturday Sabbath, at which Jesus has caused huge controversy during this period because he's healed a man at the pool of Bethesda. And so on, and it's because it happens on a Saturday. Because it's happened on the Saturday, there's a big fuss about the Sabbath, and now we're hitting a Passover, which is like a high day Sabbath. It's not a Saturday, so it's on the Thursday. The next day then is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, where the first fruits of the harvest, the very first things that were being reaped, are brought before the priests. They wave them before the Lord, and they get to keep all of the first fruits. So the first fruits belong to the priests. But that's a Friday. So that happens on a Friday. Now the Saturday, which would be the second first Sabbath, the way that Luke calls it, just a day later, is the first of those 7 Sabbaths that you count down towards Pentecost. And that's the day that this incident happens on. So actually, the way that the text kind of then unpacks. So the Pharisees saw this. So they see that the disciples, they're walking through the grain fields just outside Jerusalem, because it all must be happening around Jerusalem at this period. Because obviously, you got Sabbath after Sabbath. You can't get very far from Jerusalem with a Sabbath day journey. So it's all happening around Jerusalem. And they see the disciples picking grains, kind of rubbing the husks off in their hands and eating them. And that is considered harvesting. So they say, look, your disciples are doing what's unlawful to do on the Sabbath. Okay. Now, technically, what they're doing is there's a whole issue to do with convention going on, because you're allowed to glean in fields. You're allowed to pick grains and you're allowed to rub them and you're allowed to eat them, and that's just part of the kind of social welfare system that's established in the Old Testament. But you can only do that once the harvest has begun, because obviously you don't want to kill crops before they're too early, and so you have to wait to the wave offering to happen. So the wave offering has happened the day before. And now in that context, it so happens now the very next day happens to be a Sabbath. And so on the Sabbath, although in theory you should be able to pick them, the convention now is, of course, that's harvesting, and that's something is forbidden. So there is a kind of there's something about the timing and then the response. So he, i.e. Jesus, said to them, haven't you read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him? And this is where the little bit kind of comes in, because the wave offering has happened. So now the next day, in theory, people can start to gather their own food. The priests, because they waved the wave offering, keep that. So they get to keep what's been harvested, but then nobody else is able to start harvesting. They're not allowed to benefit from the fact, because the next day is a Sabbath. And the convention now is that obviously even the rubbing of grain in the hand is now considered harvesting. So even just enjoying the basic tiny little kind of first fruits of your own crop can't be done because it's now the Sabbath. But the priests get to eat because they already had everybody bringing their first fruits to them in the temple. You see, so they've had a whole day of of kind of getting ahead of the game. Now, as I say, Matthew doesn't spell all of this out. I'm kind of inferring it from trying to put the pieces back together, but it kind of gives some context to the conversation. It doesn't ultimately change what Jesus is driving at. So haven't you read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God and they ate the showbread, i.e. the showbread which was lawful for the priests to eat, but not you guys. And can you see there's an element of that, it seems to me, that is in here, because the first fruits that are bought on the day of the first day of harvest are now waved on the second, and now everybody can start eating and enjoying the first fruits of what come through. Except they can't because they're not allowed to harvest it, but the priests can because they already got theirs yesterday. So you kind of it adds some colour and adds some personality behind the text. How he ate the showbread, which wasn't lawful for him, nor for those with him, but for the priests only. So they were hungry, the priests had something, the priests were able to eat it, but they couldn't because technically they weren't allowed to. So haven't you, and then he says, haven't you read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath, yet they're guiltless? So there's something of the status of priesthood that is somehow exempt from the minutiae of the kind of almost obsessive, how do you get this right? How do you interpret it? They have a certain freedom. And that freedom is fundamental to the message of Jesus. You see it creeping in regularly. It's part of the message that John the Baptist brings when he says, repent, i.e. think differently, because the kingdom of heaven is at hand. I found out, because as I say, I was doing the research around for the teaching I'm doing on John the Baptist, that the English word repent, I hadn't realised this, actually... We get it from Jerome, who was a bishop in Rome in the 4th century. And he came across the Greek word metanoia, which means to think deeper, or think alongside, think further, think differently. It's made up of two parts: meta, which is either beyond, alongside, or going further, and noia, which is about kind of mental revelation. It's having a moment of understanding. So understand it differently, see it differently, think deeper. John has come and said, see it differently, think differently. You're not going to understand the kingdom and what Jesus is going to do unless you see the world differently to the way you have. That doesn't mean to say God's revelation is now defunct. It's not defunct, but you're going to have to turn your priorities upside down to see it. That's being challenged even for John. And so he sends the message, and Jesus said that the blind are being healed, the lame are raising, and so on. And so something that, and then he makes that statement, which we were saying at the beginning, for those who came in earlier, which is along the lines of, which we touched on a couple of weeks ago. Since John came and said think differently, people have looked at it and thought that the kingdom is about violence and violent people grabbing it violently, but it's not. It's about the lame being healed, the sick, and so on. And so even John was struggling with this turn it around. Jesus has then come along and gone up the Sermon on the Mount, where he radically reinterprets the law. And so the 8 Beatitudes, probably reflective of the fact that the word blessed is used 8 times when it says in the day when you enter the land and you've fulfilling the law, then there'll be these 8 blessings. So when Jesus starts the Sermon on the Mount, he's kind of saying, here we are, the law is being fulfilled and completed. Then he takes various elements of the law, you've heard it said of old, and he radically reinterprets them. He doesn't throw them away, but he rethinks them in a totally new way. He's going to say to Peter, when Peter has that key epiphany moment about you're the Christ, the Son of the living God, and he says, okay, and you Peter, because you're now listening to heaven, okay, because you're listening to heaven, so you will be the rock that I'm going to build my church on. So you become a foundational sort of thing. And he uses the term of binding and loosing. And we bring lots of Christian interpretation into that. But if you look in the rabbis, it is binding and loosing is all about setting the tone as to how you interpret the revelation of God. And the understanding in Jesus' culture, which Jesus is not disavowing, is that the law always needs a judge. It needs an interpreter, if that makes sense. And Jesus is therefore saying to Peter, now the role which has traditionally sat with the priests or maybe with the Pharisees, I'm now giving to you as my church leaders, your disciples, to reinterpret accordingly. And I find it's I don't want to get too controversial here, but I think I've always seen the thing is because interpretation of the law in our Christian understanding is nothing to do with our salvation. It's to do with the success by which we live our salvation out fruitfully. So it's not about whether you're saved or not, but it's how you live in community with each other. What God has accomplished in Christ means he is capable of dealing with our dysfunction, however bad it is, and goes on loving us. But when I'm in a small group of people trying to live out my faith with each other, sometimes if you've got somebody who kind of sees that their freedom and grace within the kingdom means that they can sleep with everybody in the youth group, you probably have to do something about that. I'm not being overly frivolous. I've had to work out some of those things over the years, because while it isn't saying that they've lost their salvation, what we are saying is your dysfunction is smashing up the church. So we have to be the interpreters, and so Jesus gives that freedom. But in the mix, it is in people who are radically having turned around their priorities that they bring when they look at the written revelation and try and interpret it in terms of life, to start to see much more clearly the grace of God, which is based on the lame getting healed, the sick getting the sick getting healed, the lepers being cleansed, people feeling release, and so on. And so, without saying here now it's a free for all morally, what I'm trying to say is that freedom is a key kind of component. And here we have a great illustration. It's a season where there's a lot of criticism starts to come towards Jesus, particularly around the issue of Sabbath breaking, which as an illustration is not dissimilar to the way Jesus has taught in the Sermon on the Mount at the beginning of this phase. So you've heard it said, don't commit murder. But what I'm saying is there's something more than that. It's actually about the anger in you. And you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. But the thing is, you all stand around lusting after each other's partners and wives, and you come up with rules as to when it doesn't count if you commit adultery. But actually, that's the real issue. And then if we have an unredeemed, unrethought it through, we can come to that and we can read that and we can say, aha, so the new Christian standard is, if you're under the old covenant, you couldn't commit adultery. The new Christian standard is, you had one lustful thought and you're kicked out and you're never going to hell. You've lost your salvation. Well, that's totally missed the point. The point is that that actually we're trying to contain and our dysfunction with a good God who is committed to our redemption. You see, that's the challenge of thinking. So I tell you, there's something. So haven't you? So Jesus is illustrating that, but there is a sense in which there is an exemption to the priesthood who are trying to manage this thing, which is not kind of a free for all, but it is because actually there is. We're not abandoning the sense of the law that God has communicated, but we have to interpret it, and we recognize we give ourselves grace because we're in that place. We're trying to understand and so on. So we're guiltless. But I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. See, Jesus is going to become the foundation, which actually allows us a degree to which in terms of the letter looks like it can be breaking it, but understanding, because we're trying to think deeper as to what God is driving at. He said, if only you had understood, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. That phrase, which it comes up several times in the Old Testament, because God puts it in several times, it's in the context of, if you trace it all the way through, I had to give you the law because you didn't listen. That's what he says. Because you weren't in an active listening relationship, I knew you would have me listen once, so I had to write it down once, and then you got it. So actually, but I'm more interested in my mercy than I am in you complying and keeping the rules. So the turnaround, the rethinking element, is to reprioritize the mercy and grace of God as looking to woo people and draw them to him, if I can put it that way. And because if you'd understood that, you would not have condemned the innocent. Well, that's a strange word to use, but I think it's in that kind of hyperbolic sense that Jesus uses it, i.e. people who actually in God's plans, God is working with to produce redemption, who are being excluded by the kind of the keeping of the laws. And here's a strange situation. You're actually making it tougher on them, because as priests, you've got all the first fruits that you need. You don't need to go and rub them in your hands. You don't have to harvest them because you had them brought to you the day before. So, as I say, there are 2 Sabbaths in that week. As I look at the passage, I wonder if Matthew was aware, because he was there, that perhaps they were doing that even on the day before, on Passover, in the week before. They were there kind of rubbing the grains in their hand. They just didn't get caught on those days. I don't know. But actually, so perhaps he remembers it, the sense of there were various Sabbaths going on here that had some controversy on them. They were part of what creates the context. It wasn't just a single Sabbath. There were maybe 2 or 3, depending on how much you... Certainly in the last week, we've gone through 3 Sabbaths. Let's put it that way. Because then he finishes it, because the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. And again, just to remind ourselves, to make the obvious statement, if you're the Lord, you are served. So actually, the Son of Man, which is an interesting phrase that Jesus uses, because it has a certain title component to it in the book of Daniel. But equally, it can be used to simply mean Joe normal. Just I'm human. I'm a son of Adam, like you guys. But what he's putting something about our humanity, that the Sabbath, which is kind of symbolic of all of the law, that was given to serve you, not for you to serve it. The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. It's not just that God is, but actually even in my humanity, the Sabbath is part of a system which is supposed to be a benefit to us. And overall, you look at all of the laws, they benefit the nation of Israel hugely. So it's much more about the benefit they bring by serving humanity. Actually, society does far better when we're not all committing adultery. It does far better when we're telling the truth. It does far better when we're not coveting what our neighbour's got, and we're finding contentment with the skills and gifts that I've got. So overall, they are beneficial for everybody. But now we don't turn it into something forensically to judge people and exclude them from the community by their failings on it. And I think that the passages Jesus is using it, because it's quite a seminal one, in fact all of them use it, is even something like the Sabbath. You've got to remember it's there to serve you, not to make you lazy, to make you indulgent and unpleasant, because actually it is the grace of God towards us, if I can put it that way. It's part of this message, which is to change your way of thinking, to reprioritize how we come to the various texts, to come to the text looking to see how do they uphold God's mercy rather than become a means to withhold God's mercy. So either uphold it or withhold it. That's a good one. I didn't notice that until I just said it. You can either uphold his mercy or you can withhold it. Using exactly the same kind of rules and regulations. And that's where the tension always is, you know. Do we say sin that grace may abound? No, because the rules are there for a good reason. But actually, if we become too forensic about who's in and who's out, and we try and enforce them on people too religiously, we don't recognize that there are all sorts of caveats that are in there. Even the priests get to break the rules quite regularly, and they're not considered guilty because they're not missing the real point for which they were given. So that's my heretical take on those verses today, which has gone out on YouTube, so lots of people can look and tell me the rules are the rules, and I should know better. But does anyone want to ask anything or clarify or even contradict what I'm just saying there?
No, don't want to contradict. I think it's fabulous. And I think this surely is the crux of the whole gospel. This is the good news, isn't it?
Yeah.
That we don't live under all of this. There's this week or last year, the South African rugby coach started running onto the field during matches as a water boy, the director of rugby. And so now World Rugby have made a law to say that directors of rugby are not able to serve as water boys.
Right.
So he's now decided to get his job title changed. And then you think, well, World Rugby will just respond again, and you'll just keep playing that game.
Yeah.
And it would have been exactly the same thing. The Pharisees coming, this woman's been married X number of times. Who's she going to be married to at the resurrection? And you can just keep going on with hypothetical questions. And for the first time, Jesus comes along and starts to question or challenge the idea of all of these things and the way that people responded to them. And as I say, surely this is the good news of the gospel and understanding grace.
Yeah.
The very thing that so many preachers are unable to communicate, and the very thing that so many people are unsure of in their faith. And so they tend toward a legalism. We may as well be Jews or even Muslims in being burdened by a law. And here Jesus comes by just challenging and starting off a chain of response of thinking in things a different way, not imposing something, not sitting down like a lawgiver, but just offering this up. So I think it's wonderful. And
I think, for me, a lot of it comes down to seeing, because I remember years back, a young guy asking me really sincerely, his early 20s, the struggle with the kind of teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. But then the kind of understanding you get from Paul, which is nothing to do with whether you keep the law or not, whether you're saved. So we have this kind of dichotomy of, do you keep it or I'm saved or not? And that's why I found it was always really helpful to see that Jesus gives permission to those who are in church leadership. I'll build my church on this. You'll have the freedom to bind and loose, to kind of set rules. To see that actually the law is really about creating a culture, not about assessing an individual for salvation or damnation, if I can put it that way. Because the reality is, it's far better if everybody waits till the wave offering happens before they start harvesting. It actually means that you don't kind of get into a competition to harvest quickly in case something goes wrong, and then you harvest too early and the food doesn't last as long, and actually it's worse for everybody. And it's better that we put restraints on our appetite. So we have seasons of fasting and seasons and so on. In actual fact, that's good for our mental well-being, as it turns out. So it's better that the culture is one that has kind of makes celebration a party of deferring pleasure, whether that's waiting for the wave offering before you start to you start to actually harvest your field. So you all wait for that, so that you don't kind of you don't try and exploit each other by getting in there quicker and earlier. But at the same time, you don't want to kind of actually get to a point where actually you leave someone who's hungry feeling even more hungry for days, whereas you're not suffering from that because you got to wave the offering the day before and keep what was brought to you, so you've got grain, so you don't need to worry about it. Now you're missing the point. Is the kind of thing. So I actually find it's very helpful to understand that the reason why the law won't disappear is because societies that pay attention to what the ideas that are embedded in those laws will actually do better than if they ignore them. It's interesting to see there's a lot of debate now around the breaking up of the foundation, the philosophical foundations of the exercise of science. So we all benefit that on Zoom you've got TVs that work because science has been around for the last 400 years. And epistemologically, it's breaking down. And there's a little thing about 2 weeks ago I saw from Jordan Peterson where he makes it explicit. He makes the statement is it's difficult to conceive of the foundations or tenets of science outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition. They are a consequence. Don't worry, Colin. I can see you. I know you're not going because you're offended by me. Thanks. That actually. I've forgotten why I was trying to say that. I've totally lost it. Why was I? Totally got.
Science being breaking down its foundations.
Oh yeah, even that's right. It's kind of it's foundations. So although people don't like to admit it. It's been kind of well and truly kind of established that actually just the concept of the idea of truth and truth being something that's worth pursuing and having an epistemological end in its own purposes and rights and all of those sort of things outside of a Judeo-Christian context don't really make sense. So actually it's not surprising that actually you're finding increasingly in science that people are now kind of like even people who work within science are kind of abandoning some of those principles. And whether it kind of and that's not the same as technology. Technology won't necessarily disappear, but technology is often embedding the science that's gone before it. So that was a very waffly way of saying there are good things that come out of culture when you consider the Ten Commandments in particular, and you think about how do they work and operate in this system. So let's build rules around those things. So we don't have to have Saturday as our special day, but it's better if we all have one day that we do kind of mark off, and legally you're allowed to not go to work on that day, which means that the church can come together. You abandon that, well, it's not that God's insulted because you don't have a Sabbath anymore, but now it's really difficult. Church numbers are far more disrupted because actually most people have to work on a Sunday now and they can't always get the agreement. So it was better while it lasted. But equally, there are issues of, do you need downtime? Yes, you do need downtime. There was an experiment in one of the countries that went Marxist where they tried to impose a 10-day week to try and break away from the Christian tradition, and basically everybody's health kind of fell apart as well. So actually it makes sense to think about the principles of Sabbath. Honouring of parents, mothers and fathers, that's an important thing to hold on to. There was a Spectator, I think it was, article a couple of weeks ago about the euthanasia laws in Canada, which now mean that under the kind of the national healthcare systems that they have out there, increasingly people are being turned down in old age for expensive treatments because they've always got the option of going and taking the pill and killing themselves. So there is actually a place, and that's not very honouring of parents. It's kind of like leave them to, they're not worth anything, let them go. Society kind of breaks down when you totally ignore, but how you understand it is you've got to be looking to see them expressing the mercy of God, not a kind of a way of controlling power and judgment over people. So that's my polemic on on the passage today. So I said, would anyone like to ask a question? And I talked for another half an hour, so that's not good.
That was excellent. Thanks, Kristen. I can't disagree with any of that.
Thank you, Neil. There you go. I see you've come inside as well. So.
Yes, but with me, it went down to about 3%, so I had to dash into.
Yeah, to come in. Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Good. Well, we've run on to 3/4 of an hour as usual.
We always do.
I know, we always do. Which puts people off watching the recordings when they come out on, because they look longer. People psychologically are more likely to watch a short video, as I'm discovering. Yeah.
Well, I thought somebody said that if you have a short video or a long one, people will watch the sort of the same percentage of.
Yeah, they do actually. It's true. On the whole, yeah.
Too much, yeah.
Yeah, no. So I need to do a highlight reel. That's the thing to do. Some people like to see a highlight reel. So choose the good moments. Just release those. Good. All right, guys. Well, it's been really good to see you all again today. So I can't remember. Is anyone doing the Thursday nights on John the Baptist? No, you're not doing that. Okay.
House group on Thursday.
So I won't see you tomorrow night, but they are available if you're kind of signed up for the teaching series. That we'll send that once the videos are all available. We'll send them out after the event. So
yeah, I've seen the links to it. So yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Brilliant. Okay, guys.
Thank you. See you
Thanks
now.
very
Thank you,
much.
Kristen.
Really helpful.
Bye.
Bye.